Hello, it's post-production Simon here. So while editing this, I've discovered that there was some sort of technical issue with my microphone. Not sure what it was. It appears both on the recording that Ela made and on my local recording, so it's clearly something at my end with my technology, though it seems to have fixed itself now that I'm recording things in post. I don't know what was going on. One of those mystery gremlins in the audio system. Unfortunately, this means that every so often I fade out a little bit, and so I've done my best in post to correct that and to try and boost the volume a little bit where that happens. And I've also, as you'll notice as you go through, had to re-record a couple of bits because it was just inaudible. But yeah, hopefully it's not too bad. Hopefully it doesn't detract too much from the episode. As I say, I've done my best. Thank you for bearing with me. Hello and welcome back to Rails to Nowhere. My name, as ever, is Simon, and returning back to us after her long absence, it's the fantastic Eleanor.
Hi.
Hello, welcome back.
Hi. I finally finished academia for a bit, so you now have to put up with me.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get a few more episodes recorded, and we'll have lots of nice content, including some content from Ela now she's finished.
Yes.
Station. This is good because I was talking to some people who listened to the show the other day, and they were saying they really like the dynamic between us. So it's nice to have you back. I've been editing the episodes where it's just me, and I don't like them that much myself. So I am sorry. Listeners.
Yes, I am sorry. I have returned from the. This will give a hint of future episodes. I've returned from the Channel Islands.
Yes,
I've completed my. I suppose sabbatical. I have done my tax evasion too. Obviously, this is a joke, which gives you an idea of where I was on the Channel Islands too. Probably, it was very interesting, and fingers crossed we'll have something good come out of that. I've got to wait. I can't talk about much more until I get results back because it's my dissertation piece. And we can't really say much until they've marked it because Turnitin exists.
Yeah, Series 2, which is now my work, and then probably going to be Ela's work, is very much the dissertation piece.
Yes.
And we're hopefully going to have some other people on talking about other dissertations soon as well. I need to send some emails.
Yes. You always need to remain close to your microphone.
I am close to my microphone.
I'm getting the... It's Discord's voice activation thing again.
Oh.
Hit your settings up quickly. Yes, this is live debugging for the Patreons only. Under the voice and video tab.
How's that?
Have you set it to disable the automatic input and just taking it all down?
Disable the automatic, and I've taken it all the way down.
Yes, that tends to make it. Yeah, there you go. That tends to make it happier.
Of course, that's. Yes, because last time we were recording, I had builders going on in the garden, so I had to have it a little bit to filter them out, didn't I?
Yes, I have builders, but hopefully they won't be too noisy.
I can't hear them at all, so that's fine.
Let's go.
So what are we talking about today? Well, in the last two episodes, I lectured on the development of suburbia, the growth of the Victorian suburb, and then the emergence of the garden suburb and the 1930s suburb. And sort of how the motor car was changing the shape of urban development. And today we're starting the actual meat and potatoes of my dissertation, which is how was the London Transport Board trying to respond to these changes and meet the new needs of the city? And it is, as I said in the last episode, very clear that the London Transport Board are aware of these changes and the new developing needs. So that's what we're looking at today. Way back when me and Aaron discussed the emergence of the motor vehicle, as I say, I discussed last week about how it was changing the shape of the city. We've talked about how the UERL and the LPTB were aware of these changes. I'm forgetting who I've been talking about different things with, but mixtures of Aaron, Ela, and myself.
Yes, and some of it on air, some of it off air.
Yeah, this really, really complicates things. And some of it with people last week at the residential that I went to. And I'm now thinking about things I was talking to David and whatever with. In this episode, we're going to start looking at the New Works programme, which if you've heard about London Transport in the 1930s and their activities, you've almost certainly heard of the New Works programme.
Yes.
It is massive construction project on the tube, massive expansion project, massive conversion of mainline lines to underground lines.
And it's often the focus of YouTube videos from the likes of Jay Foreman. I think Jules Guides has done stuff on it. Obviously, Jeff Marshall has. Diego Hazard.
Marshall.
Yeah, it's a very popular topic because it's a very large project that's all-encompassing. It sets the groundwork for the modern tube as we know it, I suppose, and it leaves a lot of interesting derelict structures and other kind of failures almost too, you can argue.
And really, it has a long-lasting effect. Things like the Elizabeth Line, which has only just opened, they have their origin in the New Works programme, because what has become the Elizabeth Line was either first proposed in the early 1900s or 1949, depending who you talk to, what interpretation they have, how much they directly link the lineage of various projects. But certainly the 1949 Abercrombie report rose out of the New Works programme, and the Elizabeth Line's whole sort of joining mainline sections out of London to an underground section in the middle, well, that's essentially what we're doing with the Central Line in this period. Spoilers for later in this episode.
Yes.
So in 1933, the LPTB comes into being, and it's right in the middle of all the mobility changes that we've been talking about. But it also only, therefore, has 6 years until the outbreak of war. Now, obviously, it doesn't know that in 1933 when it comes into being, but it means we're actually looking at a really short period of time. But they make a huge impact in those 6 short years.
It's important to also point out here, these mobility changes are not limited to London. They're happening in UK cities, up and down the country. And I can at least give the kind of the basics of what I'll be talking about soon. I was researching Jersey and the former Jersey Railway, which you would not believe existed, but it does exist, or did exist, I should say. And they also are battling with the same sort of mobility changes, the same sort of forces, just on a different scale in a different place. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, and it's happening in places like Liverpool and Glasgow and Manchester and Birmingham. And you see very similar solutions, although usually excluding the underground, because most of these places don't have an underground system. But London, as I've said before in previous episodes, just because of its position as the capital of the empire, the largest city in Britain and indeed Europe at the point in time we're talking about, it's a microcosm of all of these issues, and it is the most developed. I guess it's, whilst these issues are happening in other places, London is always ever so slightly ahead of various other places at this point in terms of where it's up to in these changes. The cars becoming a thing much quicker.
Yeah.
So, as I say, you're probably familiar with the New Works programme, so we won't go too long on this next section, but I do have, in my usual Socratic method style, what is the New Works programme? And at the time, New Works programme is kind of a fairly common and standard phrase. This makes researching the New Works programme to be quite annoying, because it's which New Works programme? Because the Underground Electric Railways of London have a New Works programme in the 20s. The New Deal that FDR is put in place in the States is very often referred to as a New Works programme.
Same sort of thing is happening there. And of course,
Yeah.
if there's one thing that we know, especially about online research, is that when America comes in, they essentially come to dominate, which makes this a lot harder.
Yes. So a New Works programme is essentially a project which is designed to see large amounts of investment, usually in public infrastructure. We see them originating since the 1920s as both unemployment busters and economic stimulation.
Yes.
So the previously mentioned FDR New Works programme / New Deal is a unemployment buster and economic
Yeah,
stimulus.
it's in direct response to the Great Depression.
And even though the Great Depression doesn't have quite the same impact on Britain as it does in the States, the UERL's New Works programme is again funded by
Mm.
government grants to try and reduce unemployment and improve public infrastructure in the 1920s
Mm.
in response to the fallout essentially of the Great Depression in the UK, which, as I say, is much more subdued than it was in the States, but there
Mm.
is still an impact because we are seeing the I want to say the early phases, but actually it's the early phases of developing globalism rather than just the
Yes.
early phases of globalism. Those really lie back in the Victorian era, but we're seeing a much quicker spread of globalism between the US and Europe.
Yes, the world is shrinking at this time, is
Yeah.
how I always like to describe it. We're shrinking, we've got ships running frequent and relatively quick crossings of the Atlantic at this point. You're getting 7 days. I forget when the first flight from the US to the UK was, but it should have happened by now if I recall my aviation history correctly. I'm not an av geek.
I haven't got it on here, but aviation is a thing that is occurring and that people are aware of. I found a fabulous letter in the archives of Frank Pick asking for Hendon to be made London's airport. So there are thoughts about aviation at this time.
Yes, I mean the DC. I was going to say the DC-3 is also coming out in around this period. You know, the classic. It's the plane that kind of makes airlines possible.
Yes, and if you look, this is the sort of point that places like Reykjavik and Gander airports, which are important stopover points for flights over the Atlantic,
Shannon, all that,
be established. Yeah. So what the 1936 New Works programme is specifically is an attempt to continue the expansion of the underground from the 1920s, basically carry on what the UERL had been doing and expand the underground further and stimulate the growth of London. It is, in headline, a series of extensions of the Central, Bakerloo and Northern lines proposed in 1936, with some of them taking over existing main line routes and others extending the underground further into virgin countryside. The LPTB is specifically concerned that the expansion of suburbia is continuing beyond the catchment of the underground, which I discussed in the last episode, and they feel that faster, more comfortable underground trains are really the only realistic way to combat the threat of car usage on the underground's monopoly. And it's the interesting dichotomy I find with the New Works programme is everyone likes to present it as a civic project, a government project, a thing done for the good of London. But the LPTB is still being run by Lord Ashfield and Frank Pick, the leaders of the UERL. And they are still thinking in the same mindset of monopoly, profit, income, revenue. Yes, Frank Pick and Ashfield embrace their public sector role enormously, and we'll talk about that in later episodes and later on in this episode as well. But they are actually also still coming at it with their mindset of the UERL. In essence, the thing that makes them really good is they're very good at getting an income and a profit for whoever their shareholder happens to be.
Yes.
For the UERL, that was private shareholders. For the LPTB, that's the national government in Westminster. Important to remember the LPTB is actually a nationally controlled organisation and not a LCC controlled organisation. Does have some bearing on their activities.
Yes, and that's would come to actually influence some things. I read an excellent piece, an excellent journal article, I think it was, about Finsbury. Is it Finsbury Park? Yeah, Finsbury Park Station, where you had LPTB and LCC services interacting, and there basically being massive disagreements between them over who gets rights to do what in the what area. It's really fascinating. Yeah. Because they're not at this point working together.
Yeah, because as me and Aaron talked about a while back, the LCC had proved itself, had been seen to have proved itself as incapable of running a large organisation like the LPTB. Go back and listen to our episode on Birth of the Motor Car, I want to say, where we discuss that. No, it's the passage of the LPTB Act in 1933 when me and Aaron discussed that. I'm forgetting the number. I think that's 7 or 8. I can't remember now.
Click, go.
The origin of the 1936 New Work programme, as I say, lies in the very similar 1920s programme of New Works, which the UERL had undertaken, which, as I say, has been partly funded by low-interest loans and grants from the government designed to stimulate the economy during the 20s. And that's a very similar funding model to what's done in the 1930s. The programme has a lot of similarities to that 1920s programme, which was aimed at expanding the underground, improving connectivity, and better integrating the network, because the UERL, as I've previously mentioned, had been buying up other underground railways. So the UERL founds the Bakerloo, Piccadilly, and part of the Northern Line, but they later buy up the Central and the City and South London railways, and they want to form them together into one network. So the 1920s programme sees rebuilding of stations, expansion of the lines, connection of the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway and the City and South London Railway to form what I put in quotes here, one line,
Yeah.
which in the 1920s and 30s is known as the rather mouthfully Morden to Edgware and High Barnet Railway,
Yeah.
and which we now know of as the Northern Line.
Yeah.
And also expanding those lines. So the extension down to Morden happens in the 1920s out into Virgin countryside. I always love looking at, there's a nice sort of aerial picture of Morden Station when it first opens, and it's just a tube station in a field.
Yep. It is incredible.
Which, if you've been to Croydon now, is just complete alien to what that place is like.
Well, not Croydon, Morden, yeah. Morden now is it is partly car infested hellhole.
Sorry, I forget Morden's not in Croydon.
Yeah, no, it's Croydon's border is a good couple miles away from Morden Station. It's a horrible, horrible place, if you ask me. You've got the Merton Civic Building there, which is an eyesore. And it's just full of, it's got a horrible, really inconveniently set up bus station outside. It's just terribly done. But the building's lovely. Morden Station is beautiful. It's just everywhere around it, apart from Morden Hall Park, which I do recommend you go to. Yeah, it's a hellish place, Morden. There you go. There's me just slagging off Morden, where, you know, I'll no doubt get comments from some friends now.
As I say, the project also includes the better integration of stations. So we see rebuilding of places like Green Park and Piccadilly Circus. This is also partially about expanding capacity, because when the UERL's tube lines open in the early 1900s, they often use, or they all use lifts to get from street to platform level. And the lifts very quickly are under capacity and become congested, and they're slow. Piccadilly Circus has 8 lifts, which is a huge number of lifts, but it's nowhere near enough. And you look at old pictures of the concourse areas at Piccadilly Circus, and they're really cramped. They're really tiny.
Yeah, it is incredible just how much throughput something like an escalator has over a bank of lifts as well. It's something you don't think about, like how good a staircase or an escalator can be. And
this is the thing, is that Piccadilly Circus, they have 8 lifts, and they replace those with, I want to say it's 7 escalators overall into the lobby, and that massively, like that hugely increases capacity of the station. I can't remember the figure, but it, like, the station initially was expected to have a capacity of like 2 million people a year, and it's 20-30 million or something like that is the expected capacity once the rebuild's done. So we're talking orders of magnitude improvement in capacity.
And you see this trend continuing today in London too, even with things like the Elizabeth line. They put a bank of 3 escalators in, which is something kind of unique to London, I've discovered, as a thing you do, but it's a very clever way to actually maximize capacity in directions as well. It's very clever.
Yeah, it gives you a peak flow capacity, and it is also a unique thing that London decided to ensure reliability, because if one fails, you've got an up and a down still.
Yes, Brixton was famous for that.
Yeah, the Victoria Line cost cutting meant they only got 2 escalators at most stations initially. So upon its immediate creation, the first major task that the LPTB saw for itself, after setting up its logo and its official stamp, and I'll put a picture of the official stamp on the Twitter when this episode goes up, because it's rather lovely. They see their next major task as being to consolidate and join up the network of rail, tram, and bus routes that they've inherited into a single coherent network. And we'll talk a little bit more about buses and trams in the next episode. This episode is going to be very underground focused, just because there's so much to talk about on the underground for this topic. An examination of their records, such as their annual board reports and the internal staff magazine, show that these efforts continue straight from the beginning of the LPTB as a continuation of the UERL's work throughout the 1930s. Some of the very early annual reports are reporting on the rebuilding of places like Green Park and Piccadilly Circus, which are still going on when the UERL is formed. And they very quickly start efforts to rebuild specifically stations to do with the Metropolitan Railway, because due to the animosity that existed between the UERL and the Metropolitan Railway, there was a unique division between the Metropolitan Railway and the rest of the UERL's lines compared to others. Even before the UERL had bought things like the Central London Railway and the City and South London Railway, they had all agreed on things like the joint advertising of the Underground, so the Roundel logo and the Underground name. There'd been efforts for joint ticketing and some efforts for joint stations. The Metropolitan Railway was fiercely independent and had not partaken on any of this, so stations are quite separate.
Yeah, and they always saw themselves as going beyond London. It's famously the only railway that managed to reach Birmingham, which I didn't know Birmingham was a suburb of London until now.
And as me and Aaron talked about back in the episode on the London Passenger Transport Act, the Metropolitan Railway had wanted to have its cake and eat it. It had both managed to get out of the 1921 grouping by claiming that it was a London local railway, and then tried to get out of the 1933 LPTB Act by claiming it was in fact a mainline company.
I mean, they still call bits of the main and the local as well.
There's still a bit of mainline company language. And the the LPTB also sees an important task as being the consolidation of things like terms and conditions of employment of the various employees that the board inherits, because the board doesn't just inherit employees of the Underground Group and the Combine and the Metropolitan Railway. They also inherit employees from Thomas Tilling, which is the next biggest bus operator in the city, the various municipal tramways, so those run by the LCC, places like West Ham and Harrow Borough, and the various smaller bus companies as well, which are all sort of integrated into their organisation and give them a huge range of terms and conditions and employee relations. And again, one of the interesting things I came across side thing on the archives was various meetings in the minutes where they're talking about how to deal with people whose pension or death in service benefits don't match the new LPTB benefits, and how to sort of tread that line between what someone was hoping they'd get for most of their career versus what they actually now get. And usually, actually, they make a reasonably fair looking decision in the favour of the employee. That's not quite what they were hoping for originally, but is better than what they were entitled to now. And I found that very interesting, given that we've currently got discussions going on about pensions and benefits, and all of that stuff on the railway.
Discussions that have always gone on and will continue to go on.
Yeah. So, as I say, these consolidations go on throughout the period, and they are led very much by Frank Pick, who is, I can't remember if he's managing director or I think he's managing director of the board's operations. I can't quite remember. And he's very much leading a lot of these organizational changes and developments throughout this period. He's also very keen to get the LT image out across the city as quickly as possible to sort of stamp the image of London Transport across its services.
This is us. This is who we are.
Yeah, and it's a very bold livery and colour scheme and logo type. So we're talking that... I was about to say mahogany. It's not mahogany.
No, it's like a
That's
blood
completely
red.
the wrong word. The word I was actually looking for was maroon, but it's not quite maroon, is it? But it's, as you say, it's a sort of blood red livery, and then the gold logo type for London Transport, which, while derived from the UERL's livery and colour scheme, is still distinct from it. Now, I mentioned the Metropolitan Railway a few moments ago, and the Metropolitan Railway is really where there's a lot of the integration that needs to happen. As I say, it's been developing in direct competition to, and with very little regard to, the UERL's network.
Yeah.
They opened their new Stanmore branch simply to spite the UERL's Edgware branch, as far as I can tell, in many ways. They are not that far apart. And they've been expanding to try and increase usage, but they've put very little thought into what this actually means for their city
Yeah,
end
their
of their
city
network.
operations.
So if you look at the Metropolitan Railways services in the city end, they go from a 4-track main line, which runs all the way from Harrow on the Hill down to Finchley Road,
Yep.
which then pinches down into a 2-track railway running through from Finchley Road through Swiss Cottage, St John's Wood, Marylebone Road, Marlborough Road, and then into Baker Street, where it then further concentrates into the Circle Line. This is causing them huge amounts
Yeah,
of
it is
congestion.
the ultimate in bottleneck.
Moving down the line for various reasons, stations at Euston and King's Cross are really badly placed for the rest of the underground and the mainline station that they serve. Euston Square Station, which is the one that serves Euston Station, is a long, long way away from the underground. It's a long, long way from the mainline station. It's far enough away from the mainline station now. The entrance to the mainline station used to be another 50 meters away from Euston Road versus where it is today. So it
Yeah.
used to be even further away.
If I recall, the Euston Arch was about a third of the way down the ramps that now exist
it's
there.
roughly.
They've got some artwork for it. It's
The Doric Arch used to be roughly in line with where the buffer stops for most of the platforms are. If you go
Yeah.
down the ramps towards, I want to say, 8 and 9, it's whichever ones are the London Overground
Yeah.
platforms. That's where it used to stand on that ramp down to those platforms. And there is some artwork that they've put out. So you've got the marks of the pillars on the floor and stuff, so you can actually see where it used to be. And right or wrong about the demolition of it, that's the reason that it was demolished, is because it was just in the way of the new bigger station.
which gives you an idea of how far away, for those who don't know, like I'd say it's a good 5-minute walk to Euston Square Station, which also has kind of pathetic entrances. It's just a couple of holes in the ground.
Yep, tiny entrances. The old King's Cross station used to be in a really bad place as well. For those who are familiar with the history of the Thameslink route, or who travel on the Thameslink route and have wondered what those disused platforms are just after you leave St Pancras on the south, that is King's Cross Thameslink.
Yep.
Previously known as King's Cross Midland City, previously known as King's Cross Metropolitan.
Yep.
And that was the original Metropolitan Railway station serving King's Cross.
Also, if you're travelling on the Met Line towards Farringdon from King's Cross, you'll also notice, if you look out the window, a couple of disused platforms. They are, again, King's Cross Met, closed, obviously, because they're just not...
the other side of the walls from the Thameslink.
Yep, and if you look, if you're heading eastbound, look out the window to your right, and you can see the roof for the old King's Cross Thameslink too.
It's, 2-3 minutes down Pentonville Road to the entrance from King's Cross Station.
Yeah, it's a short walk, but it's a reasonable walk.
And it's a busy road and chaotic junctions. And to change to the underground, you used to have to come out of that station, then go into the old Leslie Green building. So it's really hard to imagine it now, but the Leslie Green building for King's Cross Station used to be directly out the front of King's Cross Station. So the sort of triangular plaza there, there used to be a load of buildings on that, and the Leslie Green station used to face out onto Euston Road, roughly where I want to say it's a Costa Coffee now. Might be a Starbucks.
Yes, I roughly know where you're talking about. One of the coffee shops.
I believe that round building is round because it is on the top of the old lift shaft.
Ah, interesting.
There's a couple of round buildings on the surface there, and I believe that those are round because they are on top of what is now ventilation and what used to be the lift shaft.
Yes. I know what you're talking about now. Yeah. Open up a satellite map. Open up a satellite map and have a look.
Yeah, that's sort of the last vestiges of the original UERL station at King's Cross, is those sort of round buildings. If you're interested in looking at more and you've got the time, look them up on the National Archive. I've had a look.
Yes.
There's really great plans of the station and the rebuilding
Yes.
in there. And so one of the first things the LPTB does with regard to the Met is rebuild King's Cross.
Yeah, because it's a mess.
They say it's not got the capacity. It's a real mess. It's a real maze of stations, and we want to increase capacity and improve the connectivity. And so they come up with a really clever solution, which is just in front of St Pancras Station. They put a new pair of platform tunnels either side of the existing running tunnel. And they put new platforms in those, and they turn the existing running tunnel into a concourse space. So if you go to King's Cross Metropolitan Line station now, you will find that there's a pair of circular tunnels that look a lot like the rest of the underground, but they're really, really close to the surface. And then the concourse in the middle has a nice arched roof, and that's
Yep.
because that used to be the running tunnel for the
Yep. That
Metropolitan
classic
Railway.
Met Line running tunnel.
And this is also joined up with reconstruction of King's Cross Underground Station. So they build a new circular ticket hall, similar to what they'd done previously at Piccadilly Circus and Green Park. So that's the ticket hall that is directly in front of King's Cross Station.
Yep.
Old ticket hall, for those who know King's Cross from before, about 2008, I want to say now.
Yeah. The Northern Ticket Hall's the new one.
But yeah, so it's the round ticket hall, which has the escalators directly down to the Northern and the Piccadilly and Victoria lines, and then you go down further into the Northern line. That's the ticket hall that's built in the 1920s. It has connection directly onto the Metropolitan Station, or the new Metropolitan Station. It's better placed for both King's Cross and St Pancras stations than the original Metropolitan Line station. It's got better connection into both stations than the original Leslie Green building. And so it provides increased capacity. It's got those escalators that we were talking about earlier as well, and creates a better connection between the lines. It gets rid of all the interchange ticket offices that you used to have to go through to change lines in that area as well. Although I've heard rumour that one of them might still exist somewhere in some of the back passages, but I've not seen any corroborative evidence that that is the case.
TFL, let us go dig.
Yeah, TFL, let us wander around disused parts of your stations. We'll make podcast episodes on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in the 20th century, that allowed for even further expansion of the underground to even further integrate it with the new St Pancras International and King's Cross stations. The Metropolitan Railway, as I say, also suffered from congestion between Finchley Road and Baker Street. So this is identified reasonably early on, but it's a much more complex thing to solve and a much more expensive thing to solve. So it takes them slightly longer to settle on what the solution, at least interim solution, is going to be. Really, what had pushed it over the edge was the extension up to Stanmore, because that had just been pushing just slightly too many trains an hour through that little 2-track section. And so places like St John's Wood, Marlborough Road and Swiss Cottage had been being forced to close at peak hour, much to the dismay of their users. I think it's fair that the users were a little dismayed that they'd been sold to move to Swiss Cottage or St John's Wood on the basis of having a nice, easy, direct service to the city, and then finding that their morning peak service was just being withdrawn in favour of the service from out of the suburbs, out in Harrow Way. The Metropolitan Railway had been aware of this issue, and they had been proposing various solutions, which my reading of them is that they've basically desperate attempts to not have to work with the UERL to solve the problem. The most well-known of which is to add a second pair of tracks running down to Edgware Road Station. And this would have worked because the original Metropolitan layout was that you had a pair of fast tracks next to the pair of slow lines.
Yes.
So you didn't have the slow lines in the middle like you do now.
Yeah.
They were sort of next to each other.
Yeah.
And so you'd have diverted the fast tracks round to Edgware Road and connected in there.
Yeah, it was more like it is now up near Pinner and so on, is how it used to be.
Yes. And this would have solved the congestion between Baker Street and Swiss Cottage and Finchley Road, but really all it would have done is transfer the problem to the Baker Street to Edgware Road section of the line, because you'd have still had to send those trains somewhere.
It's the classic stopgap solution you do on Transport Fever.
Yes. And the LPTB come along and they go, this is patently ridiculous. And they instead use the newly integrated nature of the network to go, actually, we're going to utilise a little bit of spare capacity on the Bakerloo line, not as much as this project actually needed, but a little bit of spare capacity that exists on the Bakerloo line to divert some trains up to Stanmore via the Metropolitan Line's local service.
Yes.
The Bakerloo line already serves Baker Street Station, and so the London Transport Board decide we're going to build some extra platform and junction, and we'll send it up in some new tunnel up to Finchley Road, where it will surface next to the Metropolitan Railway, and then run on the local lines up to Wembley Park, and then take over. At this point, actually, it's not sure if it will take over the Stanmore branch or local services to Harrow or both.
Yeah,
But it will go
because
north to Wembley Park and then it will probably go somewhere else, is the sort of thinking.
yeah,
And this work begins in the mid-1930s. Various bits of work begin on the Metropolitan Railway section between Finchley Road and Wembley Park as well to enable this. Things like the introduction of a new flying junction at Wembley Park. So if you ever go up there and go north of Wembley on the Jubilee line, it dips down and goes
yeah,
under the Metropolitan Railway southbound tracks. That's constructed in this era. They rebuild various stations.
I was there the other day at Wembley. It's an impressive piece of infrastructure for what it
Really
is,
is.
and it's just very well done.
And they rebuild various stations, so the platforms at Wembley Park get reconstructed. If you look at like the footbridges, they're very definitely sort of 1930s construction. They're not as classic 1930s construction as, say, the other rebuilt stations at Dollis Hill and West Hampstead, which are very classic Art Deco 1930s stations. But if you compare those to places like Willesden Green and Neasden, you can see the sort of difference between the 1930s rebuilds and the original Metropolitan Railway stations.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful stations, by the way.
And they reconstruct the layout of the lines, so you have the slow lines in the middle and the fast lines on the outside. This is because the LPTB in this period begins to focus on the idea of cross-platform interchange. They like the idea that when changing train, if they can make it happen, you should be able to just get off a train and walk straight across the platform to the other line.
Yeah, and it's a concept that is talked about a lot in urban planning circles now. RM Transit on YouTube loves a cross-platform interchange. Whether they are the best idea is another question, but they have a lot of value.
Yeah, my mum, it's another 1930s era station built as part of the New Works programme. And my mum always talks about how when I was little, she loved being able to change from the Central to the District line at Mile End because you could just go straight across the platform with the pushchair and you didn't have to go up and down the stairs. And we, as I say, we see cross-platform interchanges being put in various places in this period. So you've got them, as I say, here at Finchley Road and Wembley Park, got them going in at Mile End, at Liverpool, not Liverpool Street, Stratford. There's cross-platform interchange between the Central Line and what is now the Elizabeth Line, but was back then the LNER suburban services. And if we look at the Northern Line, proposed Northern Line work at East Finchley, you would have had cross-platform interchange between the trains coming up from the Northern Line from Camden Town and the trains coming up from the Northern City Line down towards Moorgate via Finsbury Park, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in this episode and in the future episode that I promise about disused and unused and unbuilt sections of this work. However, almost as soon as the extension of the Bakerloo line up to Stanmore begins, the LPTB realise that this is actually only a stand-in solution in itself, and that actually it's going to really overstretch the parts of the Bakerloo line that they're feeding stuff into. So notably, Baker Street is, if you're going north, it is before busy stations like Marylebone, Paddington and Queen's Park, which are now on a branch receiving only half of the service of the central section of the Bakerloo and receiving less service than they used to. And in addition, while Elephant and Castle Station is worked exceedingly efficient, and if you look at proposed train service frequencies on some of these 1930s documents, they would make the Victoria line blush in embarrassment.
Yeah, they are impressive.
I was, just before recording this, I was having a flick through some of the 1930s writing on this, and they talk about how the peak service on the south side of the Circle line is a service every 90 seconds, which we've only just achieved on the Victoria line with new computerized signalling.
Yeah.
And when talking about specifically the working on the Metropolitan line and the service possible, they say, and bearing in mind that the Metropolitan service will need to dovetail with the 20 train per hour Hammersmith and City and Circle line service, it is felt that 18 to 20 trains an hour on the Metropolitan line running through to Aldgate is considered to be a realistic figure. So
yeah,
we're talking 40 TPH they're thinking of around the north side of the Circle, which given that today the new ATO signalling system on the Circle line is being installed to enable, what is it, 24, 26 trains an hour on that section of railway?
24 trains an hour rings a bell.
Yeah, it's somewhere in that ballpark.
This is also the time when we see weird bits of track infrastructure being permanent way being built as well to enable this, because we get things like the movable angle, as it's known on the underground coming in, much to the chagrin of those who have to worry about them during hot weather.
Yes.
Although they are one of the few turnouts on the underground that can be traversed at like 50 miles an hour perfectly fine. And it's also why we get airworked points too, because an airwork point is very quick to move, at least compared to pulled. Yeah.
The underground is now starting to move towards electric point motors because we've finally got ones that are much quicker and reliable enough. But you go down on the Jubilee line, when the points throw on the Jubilee line extension, you can still hear the hiss of air because they're air-worked points. It's also an efficiency thing because you've already got a mainline air pipe for things like the train stops. So if you've already got compressed air, it also,
you might as well use it.
Why not just keep using it for everything?
Yeah.
And the underground is run on compressed air doing everything.
Yeah,
it's why it hisses all the time.
Yeah. Well, that mainline air pipe got used for things like the ticket barriers when they installed the, I believe it was originally for the New York subway, those ticket barriers that if you get caught in are bloody painful. So all of it is drawn from that single air pipe.
Hello, it's Simon. Sorry for the brief interruption to the show. First of all, a really big thank you for listening. It means a huge amount to me and Ella that so many people enjoy listening to our ramblings about railway and transport history, and we really enjoy that we're able to bring this information and research to so many people. If you'd like to help us to spread the message even further and to help us to make Rails to Nowhere even better, then you can do so over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. You can support us for as little as £2 per month, and in doing so, we send you some thanks, such as early access to all of our episodes, some extra bonus episodes, of which you'll have heard some snippets here on the free feed, and we send you some periodic written updates about how the podcast is progressing. So thank you for listening. Thank you especially to our patrons for supporting the creation of Rails to Nowhere. We couldn't do this without any of you, regardless of whether you're paying us or not. This podcast would be nothing without listeners. It means a huge amount to both of us. Thank you very much. And now I'll let you get back to listening to the show. We just have one last little bit of the New Works program to discuss, and that's the bit that everyone really thinks about when you talk about the New Works program network expansion. And to be honest, that's why it's kind of an addendum in this episode.
Yeah.
Because the point of my dissertation and the point of all of this discussion really is to try and look at the less talked about parts of the 1930s programs of the Underground. So we're going to acknowledge it here, but the focus on this is to actually expose bits of the history that aren't so talked about. And that is what's known as the Northern Heights.
Yes, everyone loves the Northern Heights.
So the 1936 New Works program proposed a series of expansions to the network, primarily on the Central and the Northern lines. These extensions can be summarised into two categories. Those which supplemented existing services to improve the provision of service and provide new connections, and those designed to provide a new service to areas currently not served by any rail network. For the first part, we can see the expansions of the Northern Line to Edgware and High Barnet, and the expansion of the Central Line out west towards West Ruislip and out east and north towards Hainault, Epping and Ongar. These are designed to supplement an existing service, to electrify it, to provide a greater service, a faster service. The Underground Group very conscious of the speed of service that people want to get. Again, the reading I was doing just before this talks about how an average speed of about 14 miles an hour is fine for someone travelling, say, from Liverpool Street to Oxford Circus, and is indeed much quicker than they could achieve on the road at the time. but is suboptimal for somebody traveling from out of town, somewhere like Hainault or Leytonstone. They want a much faster service.
Yeah.
And if you go on the Central Line between Oxford Circus and, say, Stratford, you will notice a massive difference in the speed of the train on the pre-1930 section, so the
Yeah.
section from, say, Oxford Circus to Liverpool Street,
Yeah.
versus the section from Liverpool Street through Mile End through to Stratford, where you actually roar along at around 50 miles an hour
Yeah,
now.
you really shift, and it is slightly terrifying. Stand on Mile End platform by the tunnel portal, and then all of a sudden a howl, and this train appears because
Yep.
they hit the platform doing, I want to say it's about 40 miles an hour.
Yeah, I've seen conversations where Central Line train operators say that a good train operator can hit the platform at about 60 kilometers an hour, which is about 40 miles an hour.
Mm.
So they're improving speed and they're improving connectivity. So they're giving you a faster one-seat journey. So rather than having to go into Stratford or Liverpool Street and change train, you can in fact now just get a single seat and go all the way into central London. Similar proposal to
Mm.
what was designed for the Elizabeth line. Also, because you're connecting into a through tunnel, you can have a much more frequent service without it having to terminate at a terminus station and use up platforms, because terminating services use up platforms quite quickly.
Yeah, and they are slow.
And at this period, Liverpool Street is already using the fastest turnarounds possible on steam trains,
Mm.
like the so-called Jazz service, which is the trains out onto the Lee Valley. So to places like Cheshunt, Chingford, and Enfield, what we now know of as the London Overground section out there, as well as some of the services out towards Tottenham Hale and along that section of railway. Those are using around 6 platforms at the top of Liverpool Street, platforms 1 through 6, and they're able to turn a train around in, I want to say 6 minutes. It's a really slick turnaround
Very
at
quick
Liverpool
for a steam
Street.
turnaround.
It's absolutely phenomenal.
Because don't forget, you're having to shunt locos in and out at this point.
Yeah.
Are they running round or not?
No, so they have a loco sitting in a
Yeah.
siding waiting to back on, so
Yeah.
that's why they're getting so quickly. But it's still eating up platforms, because you've still got trains sitting in the platform for about 6 minutes, which is massively long time, and that takes up space, and it is expensive to have big stations like that in the
Yeah.
City of London.
And it also takes up paths on the actual trains, because you can't run two
Yeah.
trains into the same space because it's interlocking. It's very costly to do a terminating station.
There is an upper limit to how many services you can run into X number of terminal platforms. So by running the trains through, you can have a much more frequent service running through to the city centre.
Yeah.
A while back, I was talking to someone senior in GTR around the time of the launch of the Thameslink programme, and they were telling me that to run the level of service that the Thameslink network runs to the north and south of the Thames now, you would need to build 2 new 10 platform terminus stations, one to the north and one to the south of London,
Yeah.
if you were to do that with a terminating service. So it really gives you a sense of the difference in scale you can get in service through a terminating and a through platform.
Yeah, and I was going to say, also, it's why you see things like Sydney builds the City Loop, because you can send all the trains in one direction,
Yep.
have them all pop out in the opposite direction. And it's also, you see it in Melbourne and a lot of other cities when they build underground loops, it's to maximize capacity.
And you also have routes such as the westward extension of the Central Line up towards West Ruislip, and the Northern Heights works on the Northern Line, taking them up towards sort of Edgware and High Barnet, which are also designed to challenge the fear that new suburbs are beginning to develop that are reliant on the motor car. So especially the route through to West Ruislip, through places like Greenford, which are very poorly served by rail service prior to the arrival of the Central Line. Most of the London serving railways kind of focused on suburban traffic. Like the LNER and the Southern focus very much on suburban traffic.
Yeah, the Southern in particular is a real pusher of suburban traffic.
Yeah, if you look in the 1930s, at the start of the 1930s, the lines coming out of Liverpool Street and King's Cross, you've got a load of suburban lines feeding into those fingers of railways spreading across the network. You look at the Southern Railway and its
Waterloo, Charing
predecessors, it's just a
Cross, all of
huge,
them.
it's just a web of railways across the south of the river, across the south of London.
Yeah, it's because it's also a web that has notably not seen much expansion either. as compared. A lot of expansion happens north of the river, but the south just doesn't get.
It's kind of ended. It kind of was both a blessing and a curse, the Southern Rail Network, and we will talk more about the Southern Railway.
Yes.
In a future episode. It's not going to happen in this series, but it's going to be in a future. We'll talk a little bit more about it in this series as well, but we will talk more about it in a future episode. But comparatively, the London and North Western Railway / the Midland Railway and the Great Western Railway actually have a very lacking suburban rail route. They're mostly focused on their express services out of the city. The London and North Western route out of Euston, you have what we now know of as the Watford DC Overground Line, which is a single suburban line built alongside the main line.
Yep.
Again, not really. There's no branches on the line out of Euston.
Yeah,
it's just a single railway that runs out of Euston up towards Watford.
Built on it to very weird standards too, as compared to the actual Euston lines.
Yes, very weird standards. Partially compatible with the underground because the Bakerloo Line runs over parts of it. Also using, we'll talk about this at a future date, but also using a novel experimental form of speed signalling.
Yeah.
And again, the Midland route out of St Pancras, again, it's just a single route going up to Bedford. The only branch of it, so to speak, is the line out to Barking, what we now know of the Gospel Oak to Barking line, which used to branch off from Kentish Town, although that's got a very complex history about when and if it branches out to Kentish Town. And on the Great Western, you've got two principal routes out of Paddington. You've got what we know as the Great Western Main Line, what's still there today, running out towards Slough. And you've got the new North Main Line. And this is a railway which runs from Acton. It turns off at Acton and goes northwest up towards West Ruislip, up to Banbury, onto what we know now as the Chiltern Railway, and then went on through to Wolverhampton and Birkenhead and Liverpool, and was the Great Western Railway's route out towards the northwest and Liverpool. And so, but neither of these routes really have suburban services branching off. Yes, there's the Greenford branch, and there are suburban stations.
But there's not much.
But there's not much, especially alongside the new North Main Line. And places like Greenford are very underserved. So the the LPTB propose extending the central line up to West Ruislip and providing infill local stations alongside the Great Western Railway's new North Main Line. And these were hoped that it would provide rail service that would be attractive to people moving into these new areas, which the LPTB were very concerned were developing along car and coach-centric development models, because they're developing alongside the new Great West Road and the new A roads, and people are going into work via car or via bus. And work locations are developing in these areas alongside these main roads, which means that actually the employment model is not what it used to be. It's not necessarily that everyone gets up at 6 a.m, gets on a train to London and starts working like the City of London at 8 a.m, 9 a.m, or goes and works in the London docks or whatever, or something in central London. Actually, we're seeing a lot of new factories developing alongside these new trunk A roads. And that means that actually people don't need to travel by the underground, and Pick and Ashfield and the board are very concerned that this means the LPTB is going to lose its monopoly on large portions of transport in London.
Notably, West London is one of the few places in London with urban motorways as well.
Yes.
Something that just didn't really happen, thankfully, to London.
Yes.
But you've got the Westway and that abomination.
And everyone talks about how South London is underserved by the tube. And absolutely it is. The Southern Railway hated the tube as a concept because it would take away from their services and refused to allow for expansion. But if you look at West London is actually also relatively underserved by both tube and main line. In the south, yes, you're underserved by tube, but actually there's a very dense suburban rail network.
Yeah, and it's an electric one too that is frequent.
Yeah, I'd argue that parts of West and Northwest London are actually worse off than the south of London for public transport, or at least rail transport provision, because actually there's a relative absence of underground lines compared to northeast and east London, and a relative lack of mainline routes as well. So the Central Line is extended out towards the West Ruislip. It's hoped to go out to Denham, but it doesn't end up at Denham for various reasons, as a hope that it will attract people in from these areas. And some of these do prove it successful. Like the Northern and the Central Lines end up being incredibly busy and incredibly well used. But as we'll touch on later in this series, when we will have an episode at the end of this series where we're going to sort of cast an eye forwards to the post World War II era. Um, it doesn't really stop the car becoming a major form of transport. And as we've said, and as I keep saying, coming back to throughout this series, as it keeps happening, east-west travel, orbital travel, round London travel is neglected by the New Works programme. There are no New Works programmes to build a new orbital railway. London Transport won't really think about building an orbital railway or having an orbital service until 2008.
Yeah, with the introduction of the overground, which
Yeah.
for those who actually have to use the overground, you will argue is a useful orbital railway, but still it does not fill this massive, massive hole.
Yeah. No, it's very close in. That's like it's not as close in as the Central Line, but it's quite close in. Yes, it straddles zones 2, 3, and doesn't provide the outer London connectivity that is desperately needed. Because it's even closer in than like the North Circular and the South Circular in some places. So fundamentally, if I'm to criticise the New Works, like the New Works programme is a major thing, and it receives a lot of praise in the historical press and the transport enthusiast press for the fact that it is massive and it meets so many of the needs of London. But throughout this series, I keep highlighting the orbital travel problem. And time and again, whilst London Transport recognises that people are moving further and further out from the city and they need to provide services reaching further and further and further out into the suburbs, they fail time and again to properly assess the demand for orbital travel and what services they actually need to provide between suburbs. Because even where we look at the ideas they have for providing services in the outer suburbs, almost always it's about connecting outer suburban areas to their nearest railhead. So have buses that feed into East Croydon Station, have buses that feed into Harrow on the Hill Station. Yeah, it's a continuous problem that London Transport continues to have throughout the 1930s and beyond, where there is a neglect of the orbital traffic and where that is allowed to be, where essentially that's seen, I think,
ceded to
as
the
not the
car.
primary purpose of the organisation, and therefore it is ceded to the motor car. And to give some sort of up-to-date analysis on this and on what's going on today, this is where we find challenges, not impossibilities, not things that are insurmountable, but it's where we find challenges with implementing modern policies and modern changes in how we want people to move around, that are being triggered right now in London by things like the ULEZ expansion.
Yep.
And these are not impossible. They're not insurmountable. They're not things that cannot be overcome.
But they are things that require money, time.
These are areas that were ceded in the sort of 1930s to the motor car, and therefore they do require things like the Superloop and investment in those new forms of orbital travel. And I'm really interested to see where the Superloop ends up going and how it ends up performing. I know there's a lot of mixed views on whether it's actually going to be effective or not.
I think
This is where we find the challenges with implementing these policies. And I don't want to say impossibilities, because I'm certainly not the sort of person who's going to sit here and say outer London was built for the motor car and therefore it can never be low traffic neighbourhoods and never be served by buses or by train. It can.
It very much can.
It's a policy. It's a complex policy and something that needs careful handling.
I think it's similar arguments you see to what happens in America with the suburban housing and that sort of thing. Of people argue we can never fix this because it was built on the car. Well, you can certainly remedy some of the failures of policy, and you should never say anything is impossible, because that only damns you to never improve.
And that's always been the purpose of this research and this series of podcast episodes, is rather than classifying stuff as, oh, well, see, the motor car took over the city and therefore it's impossible to solve things. It's actually about learning about where mistakes were maybe made in the past so we can actually understand how we unpick those and how we can resolve those, because we want to see a better world. Yeah. We're both quite young. We want to see a healthy, functioning world going forward into the next sort of 50, 60 years, however long we've got left. And we want to see a better world. And we think, as historians, that part of the solution to finding a better world for the future is understanding how we got here in the past, so that we can actually identify correctly what the systemic problems might be.
Yes. And also taking it out of the hand of politics, quite frankly.
So, of course, there's no point having new railway and constructing new line extensions if you don't have the rolling stock to run on it. And if you're building a modern metro with the sort of modern stations that we associate with these extensions, so we're talking the very nice Holden buildings up at Arnos Grove or across at Sudbury Town, or the works of other architects such as Stanley Heaps up on the Jubilee Line extension. Well, what's now the Jubilee Line was the Bakerloo Line extension at the time. So we've got these modern stations with this modern service, this electrified train. There's no point in advertising that as a modern train if you don't have a modern bit of rolling stock to run on them. And throughout the years leading up to the 1930s, the various companies that came to form the LPTB had been advancing technology in regard to their rolling stock and advancing the modernity of their rolling stock. The first trains on the Metropolitan Railway were steam trains hauled by smelly, dirty steam locomotives and with slam door coaches. And despite having lots of ventilation points, which those using the subsurface still enjoy today because it lets them have air conditioning, the steam trains were not particularly popular. So the City and South London Railway had been a bit of a pioneer because they were the first underground railway to use electric traction, only the second in the UK to use electric traction, if you discount Vaux's electric railway down in Brighton.
Yeah, it's a tech demo.
Yeah, it's the Liverpool Overhead Railway and then the City and South London Railway is the order of electric railways in the UK. The City and South London brings in its electric locomotives and its carriages, which, yes, fascinating, new technology, shiny new Victorian technology, still not that detached from what you'd had previously in terms of loco haulage and carriages.
You're just swapping out the method by which you'd power that locomotive.
Yeah, and actually very labour intensive because they required 8 members of staff to run the train because you needed 2 drivers, 2 guards, and then a gateman, as they were called, between each carriage to open the sliding gates at the end of the carriages.
Yes, it is your classic. It's your classic trellis gate stock that you see back in America, crossing the American, the deep American West to the Pacific.
Yeah,
and while it looks very nice for your Western movie, not very good in a restrictive tunnel where limbs coming in contact with a tunnel.
Yeah, so through the early 1900s, there's a couple of advances in technology, both in America and, well, primarily in America and imported over to Britain, really. And principally, the big advance is the electric multiple unit, which those who use the railway now will be very familiar with the multiple unit as a concept. Basically a self-contained train. It doesn't have a loco. It will have either electric motors or a diesel engine and a couple of carriages, and it will have the cabs at each end of the carriages. And in the States, the electric multiple unit was beginning to become popular with systems such as the New York subway and the Chicago L.
Because these allow for increased capacity. They make things a lot more compact.
Yeah.
You also end up in a situation whereby your trains, while the overall units often become heavier, you end up with better axle loading because you're spreading the weight of these locomotives out, which is better on the track. All sorts of very, very, various things which make an electrical multiple unit desirable.
Yeah. And far as I'm aware, the first EMUs operating on London Underground are on the Central London Railway,
Hmm.
which are directly a result of axle loading concerns because the Central London Railways initially loco-hauled, and its locomotives have most of their electrical components on the bogie, and this is quite unusual because usually you'd want to have most of your electrical components on the body because then the suspension is between the track and the heavy electrical components.
Yep, it reduces unsprung mass,
Yeah.
which is it's very important to do, let's say.
And as Ella says, that meant they had a high unsprung mass, which drove them quite quickly to look for solutions because it was basically ripping the railway apart.
Yeah, it's a very important thing. You want to minimise your unsprung mass on any locomotive. It's why the 91s have carbon shaft drives and the motors are above the bogies rather than on the bogies. It's why that you have all sorts of very weird pieces of engineering to make these things as not as light as possible, but to have as much stuff on that sprung body, because it it means that it reduces forces, essentially, is the way to look at it.
And so basically from when the Central London Railway adopts electric multiple units, that basically becomes the standard for new deep tube lines. The City and South London Railway continue ordering locomotives for a little while as they expand northwards through 1901 through to 1907, but all of the UERL routes, they come with electric multiple units straight out of the door. And through the 1920s, they begin to improve the technology on these. They begin reducing the size of the motors, improving their speed, and crucially, one of the big advances we get in 1923, we get the standard stock introduced on the UERL network. This, principally from customer speed and comfort point of view, comes with power-operated doors, which is a major leap forward in technology.
These doors, obviously, for those that don't know what that means, that's a door that is built into the train side and is opened. Definitely will be closed remotely through generally air pressure, but can also be opened remotely in a lot of cases.
On the standard stock, it is operated by air pressure, as it is actually for quite a long time on London Underground through various iterations of rolling stock. So as Ella says, it means the doors can be released remotely, so the guard can press a button and that unlocks all the doors, and they can either be opened directly by the guard or passengers can push a little button by the door and it'll open. And it also means they can be all closed at once remotely by one person. So you're really cutting back the number of staff you need, and you're increasing the speed of boarding because you're also allowing for more doors along the body sides of the train without needing lots of people to operate manual gates and things. Now, this stock's all great. It has lots of technological improvements. It still has a large electrical cabinet right behind the driver, taking up about a third of the driving car, which is not great for capacity. And they also still look quite old. Certainly to our modern sensibilities now, they look old, but they're styled on Edwardian and Victorian clerestory coaches. They look like the generation of rolling stock they grew out of. They are not your modern electric trains, certainly as we're going into the era of Art Deco and modernism. Frank Pick and the UERL and the LPTB were keen to be as modern and forward-looking as they possibly could be. And so, in 1935, the London Passenger Transport Board succumbs to streamline mania, as I am calling it.
Something that was very common.
Yes. Quite a lot of railways around the world were really embracing the streamline train. So in the UK, the famous well-known examples are the Coronation class on the London Midland and Scottish Railway and
My most
the
favourite.
A4 on the London North Eastern Railway. There's also a slightly less well-known example of streamlining on the Great Western Railway, and the Southern Railway dabbles in streamlining. Not quite in the same way, but things like the Bullard express locomotives are an attempt at streamlining, just not quite in the same way as how the LMS and LNER do it.
You can also argue the Brighton Bells.
Yep.
I can't remember the exact year of them, but their fronts are they've got that classic curved front.
The Brighton Bell, the 5 bells, I want to say, are 35. I want to say they're dead in this period.
That. 33 and 35 they were built.
Yeah,
and they've got that lovely curved front. They look modern. It's all this.
The Southern's certainly doing that with a fair bit of its rolling stock at the time. It's giving it nice sort of Art Deco ends.
Yeah.
And around the world, we've got examples in the States and in Australia and in Germany the continent of streamlined trains with sleek fronts designed ostensibly to make them more aerodynamic. There are questions as to what extent that was actually particularly successful. But a lot of this it's actually about the image. It's about looking like the modern sculpted car. It's about looking like an aeroplane and looking like an ocean liner. It's about looking like the thing. It's being the thing. And this is also why on the LMS and the LNER you get
the future
complete rakes of trains. So the Royal Scot, it's a full consist with matching locomotive and matching carriages and full colour.
Yes, and they even go as far as to put special dividers between the coaches that are flexible to continue this image the whole way through. It's a very modern look, even for the present era. We tend to not fill these gaps in the same way, unless of course drones do walkthrough, which is mostly limited to suburban trains.
And we're not necessarily doing that to make it look aesthetic on the outside. And again, you get the same on the LNER with the White Rose and the Silver Jubilee. And if we look at the adverts that they're putting out, they're talking about how this is the most modern trains that could be going, even though actually there are diesel trains. Things like the Flying Hamburger in Germany are much more
and electric
technological advancements than this. Yeah, and then there are electric trains around the world as well. So if we go back to electric trains, we have the streamlined London Underground train, the 1935 experimental stock. I absolutely love this thing.
It is beautiful.
It's absolutely beautiful, and part of me wishes it had been built.
Well, they did build it.
They built 3 2-car units. Part of me wishes it was rolled out as the standard. Realistically, we've talked about all the problems of making a train streamlined. One of those problems is if you make a train streamline and then stick it through a tunnel that's only about 1 inch bigger than the train, you can make it as streamlined as you want, but that air is not going round the train.
No, it's being
pushed. The train is still being a piston. Like, however smooth you make the end of the train, it's still a piston in a tunnel.
Yes, and also that lovely rounded front had a slight negative side effect for drivers in that it reduces visibility. It caused some issues with signal sighting, much in the same vein as some of the new ScotRail fleets did.
Yes. And as I understand it, it caused some problems for what we call the M door, which is the emergency escape door at the front of the tube train. On a normal tube train, this is just a normal door, which just hinges. But because of the aerodynamic shape of the front of the 35 stock, it had to be quite complicatedly hinged to sort of actually swing, because it's not a flat door, it's a rounded door.
Yeah, it's a very funny shape.
And in the 1930s, it just proved way more of a maintenance headache than I think that was worth. And again, with the issues of the curved windscreen and all of that stuff, it's just not practical. So this looks really modern, and it's designed like this because it looks modern. It looks sleek. It's a really nice looking train.
It looks cool.
And it goes on the front of the magazine Modern Wonders, which I have used extensively looking at various illustrations from that in my dissertation work. And it's got sort of stuff about how the new technology and the fact, it's nice and streamlined. And that gets dropped, but we still end up with the 1938 stock, which is the production version, essentially, of the 35 stock. From the cab backwards, it's essentially the same train.
Yes. There are some minor tweaks.
Yeah, there's minor tweaks to certain things. The 35 stock was a prototype. They learnt some things to change with the 38 stock. But certainly from a passenger point of view, the 35 and 38 stock are actually almost identical. They're still appointed with the same sort of modern Art Deco decoration, electric lighting, power-operated doors, comfortable seating, reasonably nice-sized windows as well, actually.
Yeah.
And then at the front, the 38 stock still retains some aspects of the sort of styling from the 35 stock. It's still got curves at the front. It's got slight Art Deco flourishes. I love the look sort of on the top. I'm not sure if it's like covering the whistle or something, but there's a nice little grill on the
Yeah.
top.
It's to cover the whistle, from what I've gathered. It's this little grill. It's a lovely little look on it. It's very nice design.
In classic LPTB under Frank Pick style, attention to detail on the aesthetics and the passenger experience are exquisite on the train. And this becomes the poster child for the LPTB.
Yeah.
It is the modern tube train. It is, I would argue, one of the most modern looking electric trains operating in Britain at the time.
Yes, at this period, yeah. It's certainly, it's nearly unique in how it looks. And there's nothing quite like it that goes on in Britain, at this time. And even since, I think, there's nothing that's really matched it in its design, which, it's an opinion, but...
And yeah, so this really sets the scene for the rolling stock, and it's a rolling stock that matches the aesthetic that the LPTB is trying to achieve. So when you think of stations like Arnos Grove or Dollis Hill or Sudbury Town, those ones that really encapsulate encapsulate that 1920s, 1930s Art Deco design. The 1938 stock is the 1920s Art Deco modern train for the 1920s to fit into that aesthetic and to meet that goal of presenting the Underground as a modern metro with modern aesthetic and modern technology. And of course, this means that when considering the response of the LPTB to the motor car, which is in this period being seen as a modern mode of transport, it's the technological marvel of the age. If we look at any sort of advertisements and magazine articles about the motor car and the motorcycle and stuff, that's exactly how it's being viewed. It's the modern technological marvel of its age, as is the airplane. So when considering how the LPTB is fighting back against that, having a train that is so slick and so modern on its roster is a vital part of that strategy. The 1935 stock obviously is much more, but the 38 stock also hits all those points, as does some of the Q stock, which is introduced on the subsurface lines. The Q stock, those a bit of a weird mixed bag, because parts of it are rebuilds and re-engineers of existing district railway multiple units, and parts of it are brand new builds, which bear much more cosmetic resemblance to the 38 stock, except as a larger subsurface train. Realistically, it forms a crucial part of the New Works programme. It's really hard to it's impossible to divide the 38 stock and the New Works programme. Partially that's because they're kind of the same thing, because it kind of is the New Works programme. But realistically, if we're saying the New Works programme is the infrastructure works, even if you're saying the New Works programme is infrastructure and not rolling stock, that infrastructure doesn't really meet the aims the LPTB want for it of presenting a modern metro meeting the modern needs of London if you don't have a modern piece of rolling stock to run on it.
Yeah, the train is the interface for the passenger at the end of the day. That's what they interact with. It's what they are more or less always going to remember, because it's what they ride on. It's where they spend most of their time in the system. You have to make sure that that image carries through the through line, even if the older stations don't match the aesthetic as well. It's that key. This is the height of what we have.
Yeah, exactly. We are running over time of
our recording. Yes,
we are. So thank you for listening.
Yes.
We are going to be back hopefully in 2 weeks. It's possible that this episode is following a bit of a break, or that there will be a little bit of a break before the next episode, just because for various reasons producing the episodes has almost caught up with when we want them releasing. Yes. So we're I'm possibly just going to need to reset the production schedule to
You've had travel. I've had travel.
I've been traveling. I've been busy. Ella's been busy. There's various reasons that the production timeline has kind of collapsed ever so slightly. So I might need to just reset that.
Yes, we can blame British Airways. Let's blame them.
Anyway, thank you for listening. The next episode will hopefully be on technology and the embracing of new technology, and also looking a bit at buses and trams, sort of as a counterpoint to this episode.
Trams, one of my favourite things.
I'm still sort of drafting that episode, and it's possible that it might become 2 episodes. So we'll see by the time we get to recording it whether it's the same, whether it's changed from what I'm promising now.
I'll see what I can give for you for that too, because I've done some research on trams.
Yes. Otherwise, my name has been Simon, and I've been joined by fantastic Ela again, hopefully back for a number of episodes now. If you want to catch up with the podcast, then please do head over to our Twitter if it's still there when you're listening to this episode.
Yes, and if it's not been
we're
nuked.
on a very infrequently updated Instagram as well. Both of them are just search Rails to Nowhere and you'll find us. There is another Rails to Nowhere account on Instagram, but you'll know which one is us because it's got our logo on it.
Yes.
Otherwise, yes, if you'd like to support the podcast, then please do so over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. Yep. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Have a good day, and speak to you in 2 weeks' time, hopefully.
Yes. Goodbye.
Goodbye. This episode of Rails to Nowhere was presented and produced by me, Simon Sartison Co, and Eleanor Ashton. Principal research was carried out by myself, with contributions from Eleanor. Rails to Nowhere is brought to you by our fantastic patrons over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere, especially our £10 and above patron, Valkyrie Lemons. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to help Rails to Nowhere for as little as £2 per month, then you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. Otherwise, you can connect with us on social media over at twitter.com/Rails to Nowhere, or search Rails to Nowhere podcast over on Instagram. Until next time, thank you for listening and have a good day.